Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So, Pope Leo XIV has finally released his first papal document, the apostolic exhortation Dilexi Te, entirely dedicated to the topic of the poor. Now, I have read it, and I would like to share some of my first impressions with you, especially since, having studied some of the previous popes, I have noticed some patterns that you might find interesting. Before we dive in, I would like to encourage you to read Dilexi Te for yourself. Yes, my thoughts or someone else's might be helpful, sure, but they don't replace actually reading the apostolic exhortation, because there might be things that might strike you differently than me, or that might resonate more personally with you, and those are the things that you need to learn and that no one else can learn for you. So I will leave a link in the description below to the document in the Vatican website. So please feel free to read it in its entirety. It's not as long as many other papal documents, and it's well worth your time. So, alright, let's get into it. So, one of the things that we need to note is that this exhortation was not written entirely by Leo himself, as he writes right at the beginning. For this reason, in continuity with the encyclical Dilexi Te, which was Francis's last encyclical about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Pope Francis was preparing in the last months of his life an apostolic exhortation on the Church's care for the poor, to which he gave the title Dilexi Te. If you've watched one of my previous videos, you will see that I actually predicted this possibility. Sometimes a pope, out of respect for his predecessor, might publish as his first encyclical a document from his predecessor that the predecessor left unfinished. Is this what is happening with Pope Leo? Well, I have seen some reports, which I cannot confirm, that Pope Francis has indeed left an encyclical or major papal document unfinished, and so Pope Leo might want to finish. This really highlights the sense of continuity that Leo has with Francis. Now, the Vatican has not clarified exactly how much of the document came from Francis and how much came directly from Leo, but that's beside the point. Leo has fully embraced the entirety of the document and comforted it with his full magisterial authority. As he says, I am happy to make this document my own, adding some reflections, and to issue it at the beginning of my own pontificate, since I share the desire of my beloved predecessor that all Christians come to appreciate the close connection between Christ's love and his summons to care for the poor. In another of my previous videos, I also talked about four key but often overlooked principles of Catholic social teaching, and how I predicted that Leo might focus on at least some of them. So, of course, I was pleasantly surprised when I saw that Dilexi Te actually explores two of those principles with great detail: integral human development and structures of sin. Let's unpack them both. The idea of integral human development was first introduced by Pope St. Paul VI in his seminal encyclical POPULORUM PROGRESSIO. It means that human development includes the material and economic needs, yes, but also it includes psychological, cultural, and spiritual dimensions. Now, in Dilexi Te, Leo writes, in fact, there are many forms of poverty. The poverty of those who lack material means of subsistence, the poverty of those who are socially marginalized and lack the means to give voice to their dignity and abilities, moral and spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, the poverty of those who find themselves in a condition of personal or social weakness or fragility, the poverty of those who have no rights, no space, no freedom. Some economic rules have proved effective for growth, but not for integral human development. Wealth has increased, but together with inequality, with the result that new forms of poverty are emerging. Also, Leo shows his concern for integral human development by dedicating a whole section of the exhortation to the education of the poor. As he says, for the Christian faith, the education of the poor is not a favor, but a duty. Children have a right to knowledge as a fundamental requirement for the recognition of human dignity. Teaching them affirms their value, giving them the tools to transform their reality. Christian tradition considers knowledge a gift from God and a community responsibility. Christian education does not only form professionals, but also people open to goodness, beauty, and truth. Now, the second major theme, structures of sin, goes all the way back to Pope St. John Paul II in his social encyclical SOLLICITUDO Rei Socialis. It basically means that even though all sin is personal, when this sin is committed repeatedly by people in the higher spheres of society, or even not that, they can change the very fabric of society in a way that makes sin more likely. And now Leo dedicates significant attention to this concept in Dilexi Te. A particularly striking passage reads, we need to be increasingly committed to resolving the structural causes of poverty. This is a pressing need that cannot be delayed, not only for the pragmatic reason of its urgency for the good order of society, but because society needs to be cured of a sickness which is weakening and frustrating it, and which can only lead to new crises. Welfare projects, which meet certain urgent needs, should be considered merely provisional responses. I can only state once more that inequality is the root of social ills. Indeed, it frequently becomes clear that, in practice, human rights are not equal for all. And later he says, unjust structures need to be recognized and eradicated by the force of good, by changing mindsets, but also with the help of science and technology, by developing effective policies for societal change. If you'd like to know more about what integral human development and structures of sin means, especially in light of the early popes who shaped those concepts, please feel free to check my video that deals precisely about these topics. It will give you some helpful context so that you will know where Leo is coming from in Dilexi Te. Another thing that stood out to me is how Dilexi Te draws heavily from the general conferences of SALAM, the Latin American Episcopal Council. In fact, Leo references three of the five conferences of SALAM: Puebla, Medellin, and Aparecida. And in fact, he even credits Puebla with introducing the term preferential option for the poor into the Catholic lexicon. And this is important because Pope Francis's thought and theology was heavily influenced by these Latin American conferences. In fact, Francis's great emphasis on synodality stems from there. And in fact, it was in Aparecida that then Cardinal Bergoglio first rose to prominence to eventually become elected as Pope Francis. So, were these parts of Dilexi Te dealing with the general conferences of Salam written by Pope Francis? Well, we cannot say for certain because Leo himself spent a big part of his ecclesiastical career as a missionary in Latin America, so maybe he also got influenced by these conferences. And this shows that Latin American theology still has a lot to offer to the universal church, and that Pope Leo is completely on board with that. And that's important because there's still a lot of prejudice in the Western world regarding Latin American theology. So hopefully this will help dispel that. Another thing that stands out is how Dilexi Te takes a kind of overview of church history and tradition on this topic, digging deep to show how the church's love for the poor has always been a part of her own very identity. And this is key because we often see Catholics online complain that the church focuses too much on the poor, namely on the migrants, and that this focus distracts the church from doctrine and tradition. Well, Dilexi Te now makes it clear. Caring for the poor is doctrine and it is tradition, so you can't separate these two. The Pope makes it clear that from Scripture to the Church Fathers, from the saints to the Church's practice across the centuries, love and care for the poor has always been a central element of our faith. So Leo writes, I have chosen to recall the age-old history of the Church's care for the poor and with the poor in order to make clear that it has always been a central part of her life. Indeed, caring for the poor is part of the Church's great tradition. Capital T, I might add. Love for the poor is an essential element of the history of God's dealings with us. It rises up from the heart of the Church as a constant appeal to the hearts of the faithful, both individually and in our communities. Leo even quotes Pope St. John Paul II. St. John Paul II taught that the preferential option for the poor, namely the Church's love for the poor, is essential for her and a part of her constant tradition, and impels her to give attention to a world in which poverty is threatening to assume massive proportions in spite of technological and economic progress. And in a rather direct passage, Dilexi Te says, the defenders of orthodoxy are sometimes accused of passivity, indulgence, or culpable complicity regarding the intolerable situations of injustice and the political regimes which prolong them. Spiritual conversion, the intensity of the love of God and neighbor, zeal for justice and peace, the gospel meaning of the poor and of poverty, are required of everyone, and especially of pastors and those in positions of responsibility. The concern for the purity of the faith demands giving the answer of effective witness in the service of one's neighbor, the poor, and the oppressed in particular, in an integral theological fashion. So let us not be like those defenders of orthodoxy that can be accused of being complicit or passive. Let us not adopt anti traditional understandings of the poor under the guise of defending tradition for political reasons. Finally, Dilexi Te brings balance to two great pillars of church social teaching: solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity is a moral virtue that should determine the order of our institutions and that recognizes our relation of interdependence on each other. Subsidiarity requires that the larger structures of society, like the state, refrain from restricting the existential space of the smaller and more essential cells that compose society. People often think of solidarity and subsidiarity as opposites that need to be balanced or reconciled, but that's not actually the case. Far from opposing each other, solidarity and subsidiarity complement each other. In Dilexi Te, the contrast of solidarity isn't subsidiarity, it's the logic of accumulation. In this sense, no one has a right to appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life. Therefore, the use of private property must be understood in light of the traditional Catholic principle of the universal destination of goods. As Dilexi Te says, God destined the earth and all it contains for all people and nations, so that all created things would be shared fairly by all humankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity. In their use of things, people should regard the external goods they lawfully possess as not just their own, but common to others as well, in the sense that they can benefit others as well as themselves. Therefore, everyone has the right to possess a sufficient amount of the earth's goods for themselves and their family. By its nature, private property has a social dimension that is based on the law of the common destination of earthly goods. Whenever the social aspect is forgotten, ownership can often become the object of greed and the source of serious disorder. And what about subsidiarity? Well, in that note, Dilexi Te makes it clear that the poor should have a voice in shaping the policies that affect them. As one of the smallest and weakest elements of society, the poor should not be unduly restricted by the larger elements of society. So, the apostolic exhortation invites us to overcome the idea of social policies being a policy for the poor, but never with the poor, and never of the poor, much less part of a project which can bring people back together. In this sense, quoting Aparecida, Dilexi Te insists on the need to consider marginalized communities as subjects capable of creating their own culture, rather than as objects of charity on the part of others. Now, some might say that it's kind of a stretch to call this subsidiarity. In fact, Dilexi Te never uses this term. But actually, this idea of giving the poor agency on their own situation is a throwback to a 2020 general audience from Pope Francis that dealt precisely with the principle of subsidiarity. And in this address, Francis says, everyone needs to have the possibility of assuming their own responsibility in the healing processes of the society of which they are a part. When a project is launched that directly or indirectly touches certain social groups, these groups cannot be left out from participating. For example, what do you do? I go to work with the poor. Beautiful. And what do you do? I teach the poor. I tell the poor what they have to do. No, this doesn't work. The first step is to allow the poor to tell you how they live, what they need. Let everyone speak. And this is how the principle of subsidiarity works. Today, this lack of respect of the principle of subsidiarity has spread like a virus. Let us think of the great financial assistance measures enacted by states. The largest financial companies are listened to more than the people or the ones who really move the economy. Multinational companies are listened to more than social movements. Putting it in everyday language, the powerful are listened to more than the weak. And this is not the way. It is not the human way. It is not the way that Jesus taught us. It is not implementing the principle of subsidiarity. In this way, we do not permit people to be agents in their own redemption. There is this motto in the collective unconscious of some politicians or some trade unionists: everything for the people, nothing with the people. This also helps us to put in perspective Francis's well-known, though often misunderstood and even criticized, idea of going to the peripheries. Yes, we are required to go to the peripheries to aid and evangelize those who are in the margins, but that's just half of the story. As Dilexi Te reminds us, it needs to be acknowledged once more that reality is best viewed from the sidelines, and that the poor are possessed of unique insights indispensable to the church and to humanity as a whole. In light of this, it's not just that we need to evangelize the poor, but that all of us must let ourselves be evangelized by the poor. And these are my first impressions on Dilexi Te. I'm pretty sure that as discussion about the document unfolds, we will find new layers of meaning in this remarkable apostolic exhortation, and then that I will find other things to say about it. Again, I've left a link to the full document in the Vatican website in the video description below, as well as links to all the other videos and articles of mine that I've mentioned throughout this video. Also, if you enjoyed this comment, please like and subscribe so that you'll be updated whenever new videos are released. Also, please consider visiting my personal website, pedrogabrielwriter.com, so that you'll know more about my other articles and especially my books. That's all for today. God bless Let us love the poor and see you soon.